In April 1999, the UK was left in a state of shock when TV golden girl Jill Dando was murdered on her own doorstep in broad daylight in the middle of affluent Fulham in West London. The person responsible didn't run or panic, they simply walked away from the scene, and to this day, they've never been caught. Jill was one of the most recognisable faces in the country, someone millions of people welcomed into their homes every single week. And yet, with no clear motive and no obvious suspect, she was killed at her front door. What followed was a huge investigation, countless leads, and far more questions than answers. In this episode of British Murders with Stuart Blues, we're heading to West London to explore the murder of Jill Dando. It's a case that shocked the nation, divided opinion, and remains unsolved to this day. Because sometimes, even when something happens in plain sight, the truth is anything but clear. A quick one before we dive in, please make sure you're following the podcast or subscribed on YouTube. It's a small action, but it has a big impact on how far the show travels. Ratings and reviews are always appreciated, genuinely, thank you for those. And if you want to go a step further, you can listen ad-free, get episodes a day early, and unlock exclusive content by joining my community at patreon.com/British Murders. If you type Jill Dando murder into Google, you'll get hundreds of thousands of results, nearly 1 million as it happens. Yet even if you read every single one of them, none can tell you for certain who killed her. Jill was one of the most recognisable faces in the country. She was someone millions of people trusted and invited into their homes every single week. And at the height of her career, she was shot dead on her own doorstep in broad daylight. No clear motive, no murder weapon ever found. And decades later, we still have no definitive answers. But before we get anywhere near what happened in April of 1999, we need to talk about Jill herself. Because this isn't just a case about a murder. It's about someone who, at the time, pretty much everyone felt like they knew. Jill Wendy Dando was born on November 9, 1961 in Weston-super-Mare down in Somerset. Also known more locally as simply Weston, it's a typical British seaside town situated on the Bristol Channel. Think sandy beaches, an annual carnival and motorbike beach race, an amazing live music and comedy scene, plus some fantastic walks and stunning street art. Jill was born at Ashcombe House Maternity Home, weighing in at a pretty solid 9 pounds, to her parents Jack and Jean Dando. They'd already had one child, Nigel, who was a good few years older, so Jill basically completed the family of 4. They were living in a place called Whirl, which is spelled differently to how it's pronounced, and that's a village on the northeast edge of Weston. Her parents always said they were over the moon to have a daughter, and everything in their lives seemed to be perfect, but that would not remain the case for long. When Jill was still really young, it became clear something wasn't right with her physically. Her cheeks were constantly red, she'd get out of breath far too easily, and her fingernails and toenails would sometimes turn blue. It must have been absolutely terrifying for her parents. Her brother as well, who later described it as being a very worrying time, which I'm sure was him putting it lightly. At just 3 years old, Jill was taken to Weston General Hospital, and while there, a leading heart specialist called Dr. Beryl Corner examined her. What they found on the back of various tests was serious. Jill had a hole in her heart and a blocked pulmonary artery. That's a potentially fatal combination of issues. So suddenly, that happy little family with a smiling toddler was dealing with something life-threatening. She was quickly referred up to Bristol Children's Hospital, and on January 12, 1965, I'll reiterate that she was only 3, Jill underwent 8 hours of groundbreaking heart surgery. 8 long hours her family spent worrying, not knowing what the outcome would be, or if they'd ever see their little girl alive again. Thankfully though, the operation was a success, and just a few weeks later, she was running out of the hospital to meet her parents after being discharged, heading home like nothing had happened. She continued to have checkups until she was about 10, but that surgery did save her life, and what she did with that life is pretty remarkable. For her education, she attended Greenwood Junior School and Whirl Infants, where she was apparently a bit of a teacher's favourite. She was a star pupil, even taking on the role of milk monitor, a much sought-after position in the world of junior school pupils. But what stands out the most is that despite everything she'd been through with her heart condition and the surgery, she was actually quite sporty by nature, and therefore pretty active. She played netball, ran the 100 metres, and more often than not, she'd win the latter. And that love for keeping active carried on into her adult life as well. Even with a heart murmur, she was out playing tennis and keeping fit, probably more than most of us do now if we're being honest, especially those of us who are office-based. At the age of 11, she progressed to Whirl School, then Broadoak Sixth Form Centre, where she passed 2 A-levels and even became head girl between 1979 and 1980. So she wasn't just popular, she was clearly switched on as well. As a teenager, she had a good group of friends around Weston and picked up a part-time job at the local library on Saturdays. And it's no surprise that journalism was on her radar for a career, because it was already in the family. Her brother Nigel had gotten into it, and her dad had worked as a head compositor for the local paper for nearly 4 decades. Jill going down the same path as her other close family members, therefore, was basically an inevitability. After leaving sixth form, she studied journalism over in Cardiff at the South Glamorgan Institute. But even before that, she'd already started grafting. Aged 18, she went straight to the editor of the Western Mercury, a guy called John Bailey, and outright asked for a job. It was a brave move, but it paid off big time. About a month later, in 1979, she was taken on as one of the paper's first female reporters, a huge progressive step at the time. And by the sounds of it, she threw herself into the role with all her might. Her employers described her as bubbly, friendly, and the sort of person where nothing was ever too much trouble. She had a way of putting people at ease, which, if you're a journalist, is half the battle. Outside of work, she was heavily involved in the Western Dramatic Society, taking on lead roles in plays and even helping out at local events, sometimes accompanying the mayor when needed. So she wasn't just chasing stories by putting herself out there. She was well and truly part of the community's foundation, and that carried over into charity work as well. Jill volunteered for Talking for the Blind and spent time at Western General Hospital's Sunshine Radio. It was there where things started to shift, because once she got behind a microphone, it was obvious she had something about her. At around 19, she started reading news bulletins on the hospital radio station, alongside other reporters from the Mercury, and producers quickly picked up on her voice and presence. Before long, she was doing more and more, becoming a regular presenter. Then, in 1985, she spotted an advert for a role at BBC Radio Devon. With nothing to lose, she took a chance and applied. Once more, the gamble paid off, and she landed the job. She suddenly went from working as a breakfast reporter and presenter to that of a proper broadcaster for a reputable institution. But around that same time, there came a really sad moment in her life. Her mum, Jean, passed away after losing her battle with leukemia in January 1986. She was just 57. And by all accounts, they were very close. So that death hit Jill particularly hard, as it does for anyone who loses a parent. Still, Jill carried on pushing forward. In 1987, she moved into television with ITV's West Country station, TSW, before joining the BBC's regional news programme Spotlight down in Plymouth. And it was there that she started building relationships with people who'd go on to become big names themselves. Juliette Morris, Judy Spears, people of that ilk. Then, in 1988, she got her first big TV break. BBC executives convinced her to leave the West Country, which she loved, and move to London. That was such a monumental step for her, a turning point in what was already a successful career. She went on to join the BBC Breakfast News programme as a presenter alongside Bob Wilson and Sally Magnuson, and within a year, she was a key part of that show. Around that time, she began a relationship with her boss, BBC executive Bob Wheaton, which would last about 6.5 years. While all that was going on, she was covering major news stories, building her reputation. And in 1991, she really caught the attention of the general public with her live reporting during the attempted coup in the Soviet Union. She was calm and composed, exactly what people wanted from someone delivering such big news. And from there, her career continued its upward trajectory. She soon branched out beyond straight-up news reporting by co-hosting Safari UK, and then in 1993 she became the main presenter of Holiday, a British travelogue series featuring location reports on holiday destinations from all over the world. That's probably what most people remember her for, jetting off worldwide, bringing a bit of sunshine to British telly. In 1995, she took on another huge role, joining Crime Watch alongside Nick Ross. And that's important, because suddenly she wasn't just a presenter. She was a familiar face in people's living rooms when it came to serious crime. Appeals, reconstructions, helping catch offenders. By the mid to late 90s, she was everywhere. She made guest appearances on shows such as Blankety Blank, The Generation Game, Noel's House Party, and Call My Bluff. She hosted the 6 o'clock news, fronted major BBC coverage, and even lined up to earn 20 grand for the Millennium broadcast. She was at the top of her game. Her relationship with Bob Wheaton ended in 1997, reportedly down to work pressures. And after a brief relationship with a national park warden she met while filming in South Africa, she met someone else, consultant obstetrician and gynecologist Dr. Alan Farthing. They were set up on a blind date by a friend as it happens, and things moved pretty quickly because they hit it off right away. By January 1999, they were engaged, and the plan was to marry later that year in September. So not only was her career flying, but her personal life seemed to be falling nicely into place as well. What impressed me while researching Jill's background was that, despite all the fame, she never really lost touch with where she came from. She was a devout Christian and proud Westonian, always promoting her hometown wherever she could. She continued doing loads for charity and all, especially at the British Art Foundation, which makes sense given her own history. She even led their British Heart Week campaign at one point. Back home, she supported Western hospice care and helped push for better facilities in the town. She even brought the holiday programme crew down to film an episode there just to show the place off. And right at the end of her life, in April 1999, she was launching a brand new show called Antiques Inspectors, which debuted on April 25th. That was the night before she died. You honestly can't make this stuff up, can you? She was also on the cover of the Radio Times at that point, pictured standing in front of an Aston Martin in a leather jumpsuit. A real this is your moment kind of thing. People called her TV's golden girl, and it wasn't just media hyperbole. She was genuinely liked by colleagues, other presenters, people behind the scenes, and the public. Everyone seemed to say the same things about her, that she was a warm, kind, and talented woman without an ego. Nobody had a bad word to say about her. And that's what makes what happened next feel so unsettling. Because Jill wasn't someone living a risky life full of controversy. She was someone who, from the outside at least, had everything exactly where she wanted it. The only thing she had that most people don't was fame. We've now arrived at Monday, April 26, 1999, and it's on that date our main timeline begins. It was a normal spring morning in West London. That month was a particularly miserable one in the nation's capital, weather-wise, which archives describe as being unsettled with no more than 2 consecutive completely dry days. April 26 was no different, with most of the day featuring some degree of rain, varying from light drizzle to full-blown cats and dogs. But we're used to that, us Brits. So to Jill and everyone else, it was an ordinary start to the working week. People were commuting, kids were dropped off at school, you know the score. So for someone like Jill, a woman in her late 30s with no enemies, to suddenly be killed in broad daylight outside her own home, it just made no sense. She lived at number 29 Gowan Avenue in Fulham, I think it's Gowan, and if you've ever been to that part of London, you'll know it's not some dodgy back street. It's a fairly well-to-do residential road in an affluent area. Think nice terraced houses with people coming and going non-stop. Nothing about it screams danger. That morning, Jill had actually been at her fiancé Alan's place over in Chiswick on Bedford Close. That's where she mainly stayed. Her house in Fulham was still hers, but she didn't use it all that often, because she had no reason to. She left Alan's at around 10 a.m, planning to head over to the King's Mall in Hammersmith to do a bit of shopping. But then something changed out of the blue. While she was driving, she had a phone call with her agent, and for whatever reason, she decided to swing by her house in Fulham. Now, it wasn't a planned trip this, it was last minute. Something about picking up some faxes is what I gathered from my research. And that small decision ended up being crucial. Because at around 10:30 that morning, around an hour before Jill even arrived, a window cleaner noticed a man outside her house. He seemingly stood out from the crowd given how neatly dressed he was. His age was estimated at being somewhere between 35 and 40, and he had brown hair. By the looks of him and based on his behaviour, he wasn't just passing through. He was hanging around this guy. He paced up and down using what the window cleaner believed was a mobile phone, which in 1999 wasn't as common as it is now. Hence, it's something that would catch people's attention. Not long after that, another witness spotted a man matching the same description nearby at the junction of Gowan Avenue and Munster Road. This time, he was wearing black and sported square glasses, although the person said they looked a bit too big for his face. Again, it was just lingering, as if he was surveying the scene. Then, at around 11:30 a.m, Jill arrived back at her house. She pulled up outside, got out of a car, locked it, and within moments, something terrible happened. And this is where it gets a bit chilling, because we don't know for certain whether she was followed there or whether someone was already waiting for her. But what we do know is this. Her car alarm suddenly went off, only for a brief moment, and about 30 to 45 seconds later, her next-door neighbour heard her screaming. It was a loud and panicked scream, almost a desperate cry for help. But the strange thing was that nobody seems to have heard a gunshot, which, considering what actually happened, is bizarre. The next-door neighbour looked outside and saw a man, again he was well-dressed, who appeared calm while walking away from the scene. They said he didn't look flustered at all. Not rushed, not panicked. Composed was a more accurate word. He went about his business as though nothing had happened. At roughly the same time, two other neighbours reported seeing a man running away, heading east towards Fulham Palace Road. Again, their description of him was the same. A white guy, tall, in his late 30s to early 40s, with dark hair and clean-shaven. He was smartly dressed, respectable looking. One of them said he stopped briefly, opting to turn back and look towards the house before carrying on and disappearing from view. Meanwhile, Jill was lying motionless in the doorway of her home, unconscious and covered in blood. She was found by that neighbour who quickly realised something was seriously wrong. At 11:44 a.m, the London ambulance service were called, and an ambulance arrived on the scene within 6 minutes, which is incredibly quick. The current expected standard for response time in a situation such as Jill's is 7 minutes according to the NHS. I think they call it a C1 situation. Whether it was different back then, I can't say. But a second ambulance and even an emergency helicopter team were also sent to the scene. From the moment they got there, things looked bleak. So much so that some of the first responders initially thought Jill had already passed away. Elsewhere, more sightings of that smartly dressed man continued pouring in. A school caretaker and a mum out with a child both reported seeing a man clambering over railings in nearby Bishop's Park, heading in the direction of the River Thames. Again, he was a white guy, and on that occasion was acting a bit off, less composed than some of the other sightings. Then came another sighting. A man at a bus stop on Fulham Palace Road was spotted wearing a smart suit with a cream shirt. He was sweating heavily and had a mark on his nose like he'd just taken off a pair of glasses. Perhaps some square glasses that didn't quite fit him? But he never boarded a bus and soon disappeared as if by magic. Back at Jill's house, the paramedics did everything they could before rushing her to Charing Cross Hospital, yet nothing could be done to save her life. Jill Dando was officially pronounced dead at 1:03 that afternoon after suffering what were described as catastrophic head injuries. And just like that, one of the most recognisable faces in the country was gone. A murder investigation was launched almost immediately, with Detective Chief Inspector Hamish Campbell taking the lead. But even in those early stages, there was plenty of confusion. Because the nature of Jill's injuries was so severe, police didn't initially confirm publicly whether she'd been shot or stabbed. Officers were searching her front garden and the surrounding area trying to find a weapon, but didn't go into any more detail when it came to the press. At the same time, they began going from door to door, speaking to neighbours, trying to piece together what had just happened. And the big question hanging over the tragedy was a simple one. Why? What on earth could have possibly possessed someone to murder one of the nation's most beloved TV presenters? A persistently smiling woman who wouldn't have harmed a fly. Frustratingly, there was no obvious motive, no obvious signs of, say, a robbery gone wrong, no known threats or enemies. Meanwhile, her fiancé Alan was completely in the dark. He first got wind that something were wrong through a pager message from Jill's agent, who had heard rumours about what had happened and was trying to confirm if they were true. Imagine that. That's how he finds out something might have happened to his fiancée. Alan tried to get answers from wherever he could, contacting the police in the meantime. But before long, a senior officer he knew turned up at St Mary's Hospital where he worked, and that's where he was told that Jill was dead. Alan was quite quickly ruled out as a suspect, just so you know, and like everyone, just couldn't fathom what had happened. In the hours and days after the murder, police were trying to piece together what people had actually seen, and there was a lot of witness testimony to go through, yet none of it quite gave a full picture. One of the more dramatic reports came from along the River Thames. Police ended up cordoning off part of the footpath near Putney Bridge after someone claimed they'd seen a man jump into the river. Not exactly a subtle escape if that man were Jill's killer. Officers searched the area, including nearby Bishop's Park, which is only 50 metres away, and they actually recovered an object from some bushes. At the time, there was a lot of speculation about what that object might be. Was it the murder weapon, or something else linked to the killer? But, as with a lot in this case, nothing definitive ever seems to come from it. And while all that were going on, attention started to turn towards Jill's place of work. Because, of course, she was one of the main presenters on Crime Watch, a show which, ironically, attempts to help solve strange cases such as Jill's. It's worth noting here that earlier in 1999, Jill had actually spoken to the police about concerns for her personal safety before taking on that role with the BBC, which in hindsight feels quite chilling. Scotland Yard were quick to say there were no solid evidence linking her murder to Crime Watch, but that didn't stop the theory from taking hold. People started wondering, had someone featured on the show, a criminal, someone who'd been caught or exposed, decided to take revenge? It's not a massive leap, is it? Certainly not beyond the realm of being possible. Then there was another angle. Back in 1998, there'd been reports that Jill had been stalked by what was described as a superfan, a man who'd been sending her letters, making phone calls, even turning up at places he knew she'd be. That man was a retired civil servant called John Hole. He was in his early 60s at the time Jill was killed and had been fixated on her for around 4 years. Love letters were sent, as were unwanted Valentine's cards. He'd wait outside the BBC studios for her and put notes through her front door. It had got to the point where the BBC actually had to step in and send him a warning letter, after which he stopped. When Jill was killed, he spoke publicly, saying he was very sad to hear about her death. Now, I don't think the police ever even considered him as a suspect, but still, it feeds into that wider theory that an obsessed fan, in air quotes, may have been responsible for her murder. The post-mortem results soon came back, and things took a very specific turn after the fact. The examination were carried out by Home Office pathologist Dr. Ian West, and he confirmed that Jill had been shot in the side of the head with a 9mm semi-automatic handgun at close range. A single shot was enough to take the life of a woman just going about her day. There were no sign of a struggle, nor any defensive wounds, which strongly suggested Jill didn't see the attack coming. She was likely taken completely by surprise, right there on a doorstep as she was about to turn the key. She died from a catastrophic brain injury caused by that single bullet, and that detail, the single shot, really stood out, because experts started weighing in on what kind of weapon might have been used. Some suggested it were likely a Beretta, an Italian-made pistol that's relatively small. Small enough, in fact, that from a distance it could be mistaken for a mobile phone, which suddenly makes you think back to those early sightings. The man pacing outside her house, apparently on his phone. Was he actually holding a gun? Others argued it were more likely something like a Browning or a Tanfoglio. Still a 9mm, but the sort of weapon more commonly associated with organised crime. The kind of thing you don't just stumble across. It's a weapon from a criminal armoury. And that led to a bigger question. Who would have access to a weapon such as that? According to some criminologists, a professional could get hold of one fairly easily. But your average obsessed fan or stalker? Probably not. Then again, not everyone agreed. Some experts have pointed out that contract killers often use smaller caliber weapons, something quieter and less conspicuous. So the use of a 9mm doesn't automatically scream professional hit. But here's the kicker. The gun has never been found. Not at the scene, not in the river, nowhere. Although, and this is interesting, years later, an anonymous former police officer claimed that the same gun used to kill Jill may have been used in a gangland execution, based on markings on the bullet. But that's never been officially confirmed, and it speaks volumes that they chose to remain anonymous. Dr. West himself even said that, in his experience, single-shot killings like this were usually seen in either professional hits or shootings linked to Northern Ireland during the Troubles. So naturally, the execution-style theory started gaining traction. Was her murder a hit? Was someone hired to kill Jill Dando? Scotland Yard never fully committed to that idea publicly, but it was definitely on the table. At the same time, the alternative theory is still there, that she was the victim of an obsessed individual, someone fixated on her, similar to what's happened with other public figures over the years. And then, just to make things even more complicated, another theory came into play, an international one. Just 3 days before Jill's murder on April 23, 1999, NATO bombed the headquarters of Radio Television Serbia in Belgrade, killing 16 civilian workers. The attack was hugely controversial, with organisations like Amnesty International later calling it a war crime. Around that same time, just after Jill's murder, the BBC received a death threat via its switchboard. The target was Tony Hall, the head of news, and the caller claimed to be Serbian. He warned that Tony would be the next victim in retaliation for that bombing. Jill had also recently fronted an appeal for Kosovan refugees, so people started putting two and two together. Were they right to do so, though? Was this really some kind of political retaliation? A message being sent? Again, there was no solid evidence to back it up, but it's another thread in an already tangled case, and something I will discuss further towards the end of this episode, given some recent developments which were revealed last year. And, of course, there's the more realistic and less James Bond level possibility that this was merely a botched robbery, that Jill was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But that one's always fell a bit thin as far as theories go, given the violent nature of the attack. While everyone was getting out their armchair detective notebooks, proper detectives were working flat out to solve the murder. They spoke to Jill's previous romantic partners, checked CCTV around Hammersmith, and gathered statements. In total, over 1,000 statements were taken as part of the investigation, but answers were still severely lacking. Just under a month later, on May 21st, 1999, Jill was laid to rest back in her hometown of Weston-super-Mare. Her funeral took place at Clarence Park Baptist Church, and more than 2,500 people were in attendance to pay their respects. Family, friends, colleagues, and a huge outpouring from the public. Because by that point, it wasn't just a news story. It was something that had genuinely shaken the country. Fast forward 9 months to February 2000, and detectives had finally turned their attention to someone they believed may have been the person who pulled the trigger on that fateful April morning. Someone who lived just 500 yards away from Jill's home. His name? Barry Michael George. Now, I'm going to hang fire before discussing the police's dealings with George, because even now, people argue online about who killed Jill and why. You'll see all sorts if you choose to go down the rabbit hole of public forums and social media regarding this case. Everything from her murder being an organised crime hit, to Jill knowing something she shouldn't. And to be fair, even people close to the case had their own views. Nick Ross, a name many of you will recognise, worked alongside Jill on Crime Watch as I mentioned earlier, and he had a very different take to some of the more outlandish theories. Given his experience presenting that show, I'd suggest his opinion is one worth taking on board. But before we get into what Nick thinks, there's a couple of bits worth mentioning because they come up a lot. There have been claims over years that Jill had tried to raise concerns about a paedophile ring within the BBC, allegedly involving well-known names. The story goes that she passed this information up the chain in the mid-90s, but nothing ever came of it. Knowing what we know now about the various BBC scandals, it might not shock you that if that story is true, her concerns were suppressed by the corporation's higher-ups. I must state that there's no confirmed evidence that links that claim to her murder, but it's one of those theories that refuses to go away, especially given what later came out about figures like Jimmy Savile and Rolf Harris. We now know there were serious failings at the BBC around that time, abuse that went unchecked for years. So people look back and wonder if Jill had stumbled onto something. Again, there's no proof tying it to her death, but it adds another salient layer all the same. She'd also been involved in campaigns to expose pedophiles, and at one point had even received death threats serious enough that the BBC reportedly went into lockdown with armed guards on site. So when you look at all that, you can see why people started asking questions. But let's get back to Nick Ross. On July 4th, 1999, just a couple of months after Jill's murder, he wrote a letter directly to the senior investigating officer, laying out his thoughts. His theory was a lot simpler. He suggested the killer could be a lone, obsessed individual, not part of some big conspiracy, nor a professional hitman. Just one person. And his reasoning is actually quite interesting. He basically said that when you're on television, especially popular shows such as Crime Watch, your circle of acquaintances isn't in the hundreds, it's millions. People feel like they know you, like you're part of their lives, sitting in the living room with them, sometimes even the bedroom. And because of that, the chances of one of those people being unstable, obsessed, even dangerous, are a lot higher than we regular folk like to think. It's a chilling thought, but it makes sense, and I highly recommend you check out Nick's website, nickross.com, for further information. It's really detailed. Back to Barry George now. He was arrested in the early hours of May 25, 2000 at his flat on Crookham Road in Fulham. With that, he was taken in for questioning. Just a few days later, was charged with Jill's murder. At the time, he was 40 years old, and straight away you could understand why detectives were interested in speaking to him. He was the son of a retired police officer, and apparently at one point wanted to join the force himself, but the reason they wanted him was due to his sordid past, made up of a beyond concerning criminal history. George had a history of stalking women and had previously been convicted of attempted rape after attacking a 20-year-old student near her front door years earlier. He served 33 months for that offence and also faced other accusations of indecent assault against multiple women. Adding to that, when police searched his flat, they found undeveloped photos of local women and 4 copies of the BBC's in-house magazine Ariel featuring Jill Dando after her death. The latter alone raised plenty of eyebrows. But then there was the forensic side of things. A scientist found a tiny particle in Barry's coat, a pinprick in size, and believed it to be firearms discharge residue. Alongside that, a photo was found of him posing with a pistol and wearing what looks like a gas mask. Not a great look when you've been investigated for a shooting. Police also said he lied repeatedly during questioning. So when they put all that together, in their minds, they had their man. Bang to rights as far as they were concerned. But here's where it gets complicated, because George isn't exactly your typical suspect. He'd changed his name to Bulsara after Freddie Mercury's birth surname and even claimed at one point to be his cousin. It was later revealed that George had autism, brain damage affecting his frontal lobe, learning difficulties, and an IQ of around 75, which is a fair bit lower than the national average of 99. And he'd also spent years pretending to be things he wasn't. He'd impersonated a police officer, a businessman with a fake company, even a stuntman, at one point going to the length of injuring himself while trying to pull off a motorbike stunt in a stadium. He was a real Walter Mitty type character, it seems. So you got this strange mix, a man who was clearly vulnerable, but also someone comfortably capable of deception. So why did the police zero in on him? Well, witnesses placed him in the area at the time Jill was shot. He'd reportedly been seen in Gowan Avenue hours before the murder and shortly after killing. 2 separate witnesses spotted him nearby acting agitated. One of them was so concerned they kept calling the police incident room in the days that followed. Even stranger, George allegedly went back to those same witnesses the next day, trying to convince them he'd been there at different times and that he'd been wearing different clothes, which doesn't exactly scream innocence. Further suspicion came when it was revealed he had a history of stalking women under surveillance. Back in 1983, he'd even been found in the grounds of Kensington Palace, where Princess Diana lived at the time, dressed in combat gear, carrying a knife and a 15-foot-long rope, all while wearing a balaclava. Somehow, he wasn't charged at the time, as he was thought to have mental health issues. He briefly had a wife at one point, but she was reportedly so frightened of him that she fled back to her native Japan after reporting his behaviour to the police. Years later, she said she believed he was responsible for Jill's murder. And despite him denying any interest in Jill or the BBC, police found camera film showing he'd taken photos of women directly from his telly. Presenters like Anthea Turner and Sue Richardson. They also found a note with the name of a female Crime Watch researcher. Then there was the gun. George denied ever owning one, but we already know there was an undeveloped photo of him holding one in his hand, posing with weapon. More concerningly, it was the same type of weapon, a pistol, believed to have been used in Jill's murder. Plus, he'd previously had weapons training in the Territorial Army and had been part of a pistol club. The evidence, circumstantial as it may have been, was starting to mount against George. His trial commenced in May 2001 at the Old Bailey, yet the only real piece of evidence presented was that tiny speck of gunshot residue. Even at the time, experts admitted it were not conclusive, and it was honestly the smallest amount detectable. But they argued it was unlikely to just have appeared there by chance. The jury weren't sure what to make of the evidence and ended up deliberating for a good few days, unable to reach a unanimous decision. Eventually, Mr. Justice Gage said he would accept a majority verdict, and with that, in early July 2001, George was found guilty of murder by a 10-1 majority. He received a life sentence on the back of that, but his story was far from over. He maintained his innocence from day one and tried to appeal his conviction, but in 2002, judges rejected it. The House of Lords also refused to hear his case. Inside prison, things were rough for George, as you might expect. He spent time in some of the most notorious prisons our shores have to offer, including Belmarsh, which has a reputation for being one of the UK's toughest prisons. He ended up being placed on suicide watch after attempting to take his own life, before later being moved to another high-security prison, HMP Whitemoor, alongside some of the country's most notorious killers. At one point, he told a newspaper he believed he would be killed in prison, and that people in authority would rather he die than reopen the case. He kept insisting he didn't kill Jill, saying he thought someone from the criminal underworld was responsible. At that stage, nobody were listening, but years later, things would eventually start to shift. The Forensic Science Service began to question the reliability of that supposed key piece of evidence, which led to a review by the Criminal Cases Review Commission, or CCRC. George went on to appeal his conviction again, and that time his legal team successfully argued that the forensic evidence shouldn't have been relied upon in the way it was. At his retrial, the jury never even heard about the gunshot residue, and in August 2008, George was unanimously found not guilty. Now, this next part is important, because we need to make the distinction clear that George was acquitted, not exonerated. Legally, that means the court only found there wasn't enough evidence to convict him. It doesn't necessarily mean he was proven completely innocent beyond all doubt. It is a subtle difference, I appreciate that. But in a case like this, it matters greatly. To make it even clearer, an acquittal occurs when a defendant is found not guilty of the charges brought against him. On the other hand, exoneration goes a step further, implying the complete absolution of fault or guilt. It often follows the emergence of new evidence, which could clear the individual or point to another perpetrator. After his release, George eventually moved to Ireland in 2010 in an attempt to live a quieter life away from the media frenzy. But even now, people are still split. Some still believe he did it, whereas others are convinced he was the victim of a miscarriage of justice. And then you got people like Nick Ross, who still leans towards that lone, obsessed individual theory. He's pointed out that a lot of the details of the crime don't really fit a professional hit like the papers and police suggested it was. There were no clear getaway plan and no getaway vehicle. It was committed in a high-risk location in broad daylight, using a weapon that could have easily misfired. Even the act itself, getting that close right up to her, the gun actually making contact with Jill's head, suggested something more personal and emotional. A forensic psychologist even concluded that the killer was likely a loner with a severe personality disorder. But apparently, that line of thinking wasn't fully followed up at the time by detectives. And just when you think this case couldn't grow any more legs, it's still evolving. As recently as 2025, detectives have been looking into new information, including claims linking a Serbian paramilitary figure to the murder, based on CCTV analysis and witness identification. So even now, 27 years later, we're still asking the same question. Who killed Jill Dando. And why? Nobody knows for certain, so where does that actually leave us? Well, legally speaking, Barry George is a free man. He was acquitted. The courts overturned his conviction and he walked out of prison after serving a few years behind bars. But as we said earlier, acquitted doesn't necessarily mean exonerated. It just means the case against him wasn't strong enough to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And for a lot of people, that still leaves a big question mark hanging over everything. Did they get the wrong man? Or did they let Jill's killer walk free? Perhaps it was something bigger. Was it linked to Serbia, retaliation for that NATO bombing, a hit far more organised than it first appeared? Or was it closer to home, a disgruntled criminal, someone who'd been sent down on the back of a Crime Watch appeal, someone who held a grudge and decided to act on it? Or even simpler than that, was it just one person who was obsessed and fixated on Jill to the point where they killed her? Just like what happened with John Lennon and his fellow Beatle George Harrison, who survived an attack from a so-called fan in the same year Jill were murdered. I'll throw it over to you, dear listener. What do you think happened? Let me know, because this is one of them cases where the more you look into it, the less clear it becomes. Sadly, Jill's dad has also since passed away, not finding out who was responsible for his daughter's murder. But one thing's for certain. Jill Dando was a woman who was loved by millions. Someone who was kind and grounded. A genuinely good person whose life was taken far too soon. Thanks so much for listening to British Murders with Stuart Blues. If you'd like to listen without ads, get episodes a day early, and access exclusive content not released on the main feed, you can support the show at patreon.com/British Murders. Following the podcast or subscribing on YouTube really helps British Murders continue to grow, and I'm genuinely grateful for your support. Ratings and reviews make a big difference too. Thanks if you've left one or plan to. That's it for now. Until next time, cheerio.